We have we have audio. Good afternoon, welcome. Thank you for taking your time joining this session on choosing the right OS deployment tool. My name is Johan, this is Michael, and we will be your host for the next 75 minutes. And when doing sessions like this, it's appropriate, or it's been seen as appropriate to at least present yourself as a presenter before you kick off the session. And that normally goes with you start where you work, where you live. We thought that was boring, so we did a movie instead. So let me switch over to this one, to the magic video folder, and intro. Kvalitet på bilderna.
De sista, ja. Now try to explain to kids what you do for a living. It's kind of hard.
No, it's easy now. We can just say it's on YouTube and they get it from there.
You can check Daddy on YouTube.
All right. In this session, we focus on two things: tools and solutions. Tools are stuff that you need to know, but are not supposed to use. And solutions are using tools in the background. Now, when Microsoft set out to do Windows 8 and Windows 7, and actually it began with Windows Vista, they meant to do an imaging point of view. Everything now is image-based. But we still automate a setup through various components. So these days, we use ADK as a tool set to provide deployment features for Windows. And ADK in turn contains components like Windows PE, User State Migration Tool, Performance Toolkit, and a lot of other stuff, tools related to deployment. Then we also have Windows Deployment Services that is not really it's more like an engine to apply images over the network. And we use that to start boot images and apply operating system images, but not necessarily only using Windows Deployment Services. Then we have MDT, which is actually two things in this session. MDT symbolizes solutions here. And the solutions that we are going to demonstrate is the light touch part, the standalone deployment solution, and also the Config Manager 2012 SP1 OSD part. But we'll come back to that later. We have WSIM, who's really part of the ADK as a tool set, but that's an authoring tool for unattended files. And then, of course, we have the unattended file itself, which is being used for...
Well, that's the automation. That's what really makes Windows install automatically. It's always needed. Now, if I go out to a website and I search for different deployment methods, I will find things like high volume or manual install and all these different names. There are basically two ways of installing Windows. You either sit in front of the computer and you have your DVD in the hand. We don't consider that to be a solution. We call it Jurassic Park deployment. It's just dumb.
Actually, if you navigate through various sites on the internet, you can actually find a name of that Jurassic deployment. It's called High Touch. But what it really means, it's a manual deployment. It's next, 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 and so on. We don't do that. No matter how you deploy Windows, the next, 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 you don't do that at all.
So high volume, high touch means I bought a computer and here's the DVD. So what we are going to focus on is the other ones, some kind of automation. And it starts by the unattended XML file.
Yes, because the unattended file is the way we automate Windows. As I said, we use WSIM to manage and change them, create them, edit them, open a template. And then it's simply about making sure that that file is in the right location. And then setup will happily pick up and use it. So let me show you real quick.
It's kind of fun because you mentioned the right location, right? So we do have customers saying, I created an unattended XML file and I put it in this folder and it didn't work. Try to search for another unattended XML file and you will find it in another folder, and Windows will pick up that unattended file before it picks up your file. So you really need to have only one, or you really need to know which one it will pick up at that time.
All right, so if I go over to my demo environment here and remote into one of my servers.
While you're doing that, may I ask you, how many people on this planet Earth do you know that can write an unattended XML file from scratch and make it work perfectly fine? You're the other guy.
All right. Normally, you don't create these files from scratch. You normally base or start off with a template. But in this folder, I have a few unattended files available. There are a few files for Windows Deployment Services, but there is also a core Windows 8 unattended file. Now, when opening that file in Image Manager, it looks like this. It will have all these different passes that Microsoft is using as part of a deployment. And it's dead simple. Back in the XP days, you used to have different scripts to do different things. You had the unattended text file to do automation in the setup. You had the sysprep inf file to do automation during sysprep or when deploying an XP image. You used to have a winbom ini file when doing WinPE stuff. All that is gone. It's combined into one single unattended file. But these files has sections. So if I want to do stuff in my boot image, when I start on WinPE, if I want to do something, guess what? This is the section I need to put those settings in. If I want to launch a script, this is where I add it. If I want to set the screen resolution in WinPE, that's where I will add it. If I run sysprep to prepare a reference image, this is where I will put those settings. For example, I may create a reference image for a virtual machine. I already have all drivers. I don't want Windows to redetect all drivers. I want simply Windows to please use what you already have. It's already a VM. I'm going to deploy it to another VM. No need for driver detection. Then I can simply tell the script or the unattended file, hey, keep the drivers. Don't bother. And that will have to go into the generalized section. Specialize is where you put in stuff like computer name, what domain to join, etc. This is the phase the setup is going through when you have applied the image and rebooted the machine and it eventually comes up. Now, of course, you can find all the components. For example, if I want to add disk information to do some disk partitioning, I can right-click here and say Add Settings. And this authoring tool will help you to put the settings in the correct section. So don't use Notepad to edit the unattended file. Use this tool because it will actually force you to put the right settings in the right section of that file.
Note that it's only helping you to get the right information in the right place. There is a validate function where you can validate that that is correct. However, all the values you provide, let's pick up something with the value. It doesn't really matter. You're going to see that it says the lowest value you can type is 1, and the highest number is whatever. It doesn't really tell you that you need to type in 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 4,500 for that matter. So you really need to press F1 if you're not sure how this works to read from the help file. It will explain what you should put in.
You can also add components to this. So there is a foundation package that you can add. And this will allow you to set stuff like what features in Windows that should be enabled by default. So imagine you're a hardcore printing fan. You maybe want to enable those features.
Please note the version number. It says 6.29200.16384. So this unattended XML file works perfectly fine with this version of Windows.
Only.
Only. Then you change to Windows 8 Service Pack 1, and you need to create a new unattended XML file because you can't inject the printing feature from the RTM version into a Service Pack 1 version.
All right. So when I start a virtual machine on a normal Windows 8 boot image or image, I will simply start off a normal Windows 7 ISO.
Windows 8?
Windows
please.
8.
Windows 7 is legacy.
I know.
Yeah.
Windows 8 ISO. I have no unattended file anywhere remotely near this machine right now. So when I boot on an ISO file, it will simply launch WinP4. And if WinP4 boots, it will give me the setup. Now, there are some challenges around WinP4, and that it's not all hardware actually supports it, because WinP4 requires some functions in the CPU of that machine and in the BIOS. The NX and SSE and physical address extension support needs to be there, otherwise it may freeze. We have seen that a lot on server deployments, but the fix has been very easy. We simply patch the machines. We upgrade BIOS or firmware, and then WinP4 happily boots. We did a server deployment project not too long ago with brand new HP servers. They were generation 8, so last year's servers. Not a single of them booted WinP4, not a single server, until we updated BIOS, and then it happily booted. Well, as you can see, I started the Windows 8 setup, and it simply aborted. Now, the unattended file I showed you on the server, the one I opened here, if I put that on a virtual floppy, which I have here, and name it exactly auto unattend, then setup will find it and use it. You can also run setup exe with a switch and specify what unattend file to use. So if I simply mount that file again, I will mount that floppy.
That was a DVD.
I'm about to mount the floppy. Give me a second, sir.
Yeah, but that's the ISO image. You need to.
Yes. I need to be selecting the right menu option. Thank you, sir.
No problem.
You will not get a swag.
No, since I'm paying for them, so. No.
So I'm resetting this machine. So now I have the ISO mounted, I have the floppy mounted, and on the floppy, I have an auto unattend file on that floppy. How many think this will actually work? Anyone who doesn't think it will work? Few of you. Well, let's see. We can see setup kicking in shortly. And when you see this blue background here, or purple background, you can actually always press Shift F10 to find log files and review information on that system, if you want to. The main setup log file is setup.act.log. And if setup breaks, that's the file you go to and review what's going on.
It normally pops up a message say, would you like to try again?
It failed. Why? Does anyone know why it failed? If you give me the correct answer, you can get this book. Michael, run.
Have you ever seen me running?
Okay, walk quickly.
I can walk.
Indeed, I mounted the wrong architecture. Because in the auto unattend file, it's platform specific. If I open it up in Notepad to review it more, this is where I will specify the architecture of that file. And I booted on a 32-bit one, but I booted on a 64-bit image. So what I have to do, of course, is revert this snapshot again select the ISO again, Windows 8, just check in, 64-bit. And I will also select the floppy, and I will select the 64-bit floppy.
Now, it is possible to combine both 32 and 64-bit information in the same unattended XML file if you want to do that.
The problem is, it's only the default setup that will work. So we've seen, for example, config manager customers trying to use a single unattended XML file. And the normal deployment works just great. It works perfectly, it's automated, and life is good. And suddenly they try to change a language. Or they want to set a time zone. Or they want to set an OU in Active Directory to store a machine into, and then it breaks. So in config manager, you actually need to have different unattended files, and you want to do settings for them. But, all right. So now this one will simply kick in, and it will run through the setup, and it will not break because I now have the correct unattended file. Now, booting an ISO like this is fine, but we do network deployments. We don't run around with CDs or USB sticks unless we really have to.
I think the issue is we don't run.
Well, we...
Define we?
One of us
doesn't run.
Runs,
yeah.
and the other one doesn't. Now, to help doing network stuff, we have our friend Mr. Pixie.
Yeah, so booting on CD together with the floppy makes perfectly sense when you have a low number of machines, but from a network perspective, would you mind switching over?
I can't, because it needs to set a demo first.
Okay.
Then I can switch.
Thank you. So Windows deployment services in Windows Server 2012 has changed. It has improved very much.
It's still a tool.
But it's still a tool. It's close to being a solution. What you can do now is, you install it. It's installed. You need to configure some basic things like what is the Pixie response going to be? It still has the require an administrator approval, and that kind of solution, that kind of tool works in a very small environment with like 2 to 5 computers or something like that. It is possible to configure a lot of things, like this is the name it's going to have. We can define the location of the machine where it's supposed to be in the UI, right? We can define Pixie client. We can define the unattended XML file for the unattended installation of the Windows part, and we need to have another one. So in WDS, they have split the unattended XML file in 2 parts. One for the configuration of the disks, and one for installing the operating system. So the WinP part goes for the WDS server, and the other goes for the image itself. So they changed a lot of things you can modify, which is nice, right? They also added a UI for something called Active Directory pre-staged devices. That means that I can add a device, specify its name, specify either the UID number or the MAC address. I already done that, so here's the device ID. If I want to put that machine in a specific OU, I can, of course, type in the OU path. There's obviously no browse button here. I can define, it should boot from this server, how it's going to use the Pixie, and I can also define what boot image it should have. It is also possible to create an unattended XML file, which is nice. So I can define and say, here's the unattended XML file, and I want to have the following language. And I can either specify a boot image and say, create an unattended XML file for the boot image, or create an unattended XML file from the install image. The difference is that if I specify that, it will create an unattended XML file that actually works for 32-bit and 64-bit and ARM and all kinds of different things. If I specify the install image, it's only going to create an unattended XML file for that purposes. You also define the disks and the username that you should have when you log on. You can also define join rights. And And this really almost works nice. The problem is it's not really dynamic. You have more or less one unattended XML file per machine, which works perfectly fine when you have 5 or maybe 6 machines, maybe even 10, something like that. To make this work, well, we need to add a boot image, and the boot image is the setup Vim file together with the installed Vim file. So we add the install and we add the boot, and then pretty much we boot the machine. So let's find a machine where I can boot.
So what Windows Deployment Services really gives you is just a way of very statically assigning an image or applying an image to a machine. So in environments that doesn't change at all, ever, when you just have a big, fat image that you deploy, don't worry about updates, applications, drivers, whatever. You don't do that. You just apply a Vim file. Then Windows Deployment Services is for you. Unfortunately, we have not yet met a single customer who doesn't want to have drivers, updates, applications, and settings as part of their deployment. And quite frankly, Windows Deployment Services doesn't give you that on its own.
Close, because it really has improved the driver thing. Now it has a node called drivers, where you can create packages, and you can really create filters. And now you can have something new called manufacturer and model. It's a new feature that Microsoft added to the Windows deployment.
So
services.
if I have a 2-tier driver, I wouldn't mention any name, but Enforce, Broadcom, and Sigmatel,
for instance,
they would actually work.
It depends, because if you use the plug-and-play feature, no, it doesn't work the same way. I mean, we still have the same problem. But what we can do is that we can say, inject all these drivers, install all these drivers. There's one thing that is really nice, and that is the feature of getting the expected deployment results. So now you can type in and say, well, this is the Microsoft machine, and the model is virtual machine. If I have the sub-notebook chassis, I'm not going to add that. And I do next, and I select the architecture, and I select the boot image. I can actually see what kind of drivers that will be injected. So it has improved, but we need to be honest. It's correct what Johan said. This supports new machine only. This supports wiping the entire machine, deploy the operating system, and then you're done, and nothing else. It's good for OEMs, it's good for classroom deployment, and if you do run the Olympics and you are forced to install 10,000 computers in a day or two, then it also works. But I don't do that very often.
It's a good exercise, though. So what we need is some component that will take this unattended file that I showed you, that will take Windows Deployment Services that Michael showed you, and tie them together and add dynamic abilities to it. Because, for example, we want to have the computers to be named differently. It's kind of bad if you have one single unattended file which named every machine to Mike02. It's great for the first one you deploy, but for the others, it's going to be messy, especially if you try to run Skype on them. They can't even talk then. So we want to have an engine that is outside our deployment that will automatically create the template of the unattended file, copy the template locally, and inject the settings that are being used for the deployment. And that is being done by two solutions that Microsoft provides. It's MDT Light Touch and it's Config Manager. So Michael is going to start off with a 19.5-minute session on Light Touch, and I will follow up with a 19.5 session on Config Manager. Plus minus 2 seconds.
So I have the 5-minute demo now, right? Have you switched to my screen?
No, I wasn't sure you were ready. Are you ready?
I'm never ready.
All right.
It works anyway. So what you see is Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, the workbench. Now, Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and Configuration Manager pretty much works in the same way. It reads information from an external source. It uses those values, and then it updates the unattended XML file on the fly. That's what's really happening here. In Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, which is used when you don't have a configuration manager near your organization at all, you import operating systems. And importing operating system is just pointing to the DVD where you have all the files for the operating system. And when you have imported that, you might need to change the name so it looks more decent. In this case, it's called a custom Windows 8 x64, and the reason it's called custom is because we have a custom image that is already created. We can also add all the drivers here. Now, in this case, I created a folder structure. It's called Windows 8. And before we go any further, I think I should open up Zoom it, so you can see how it looks. Yeah, there you go. So here we created a folder structure. It's called Windows 8 and HP EliteBook 8560W, and we put all the drivers in there. So we have the operating system, we have the drivers, and we might need to add applications like Office, like Java, and things like that. When that is done, we create task sequences. And creating a task sequence is not that hard. You give it an ID, like custom Windows 8 x64 version 2, custom Windows 8 x64 v2. Next. And then you pick a task sequence, and you can see that Microsoft Deployment Toolkit supports many different sequences. The standard client task sequences works for installing new computers and refreshing old operating systems. So I'm going to pick that one. Next. And then we pick the operating system. It's not that hard. We pick that. And we can specify product keys and things like that. I'm not going to do that right now. And the reason is because all those values I prefer to have outside the unattended XML file. Instead, I have them in the rule sets. So we have something called rules, and in rules we have defined a lot of things like the time zone, the password, things like that.
Can you just highlight the time zone name, for example?
You mean this one?
Yes. So this setting obviously will configure the machine to be in a specific time zone. Now, how does that setting go into the unattended file during deployment?
Well, if we check the task sequence we have here, there's a small step. There's actually two steps. There's a step called gather. The gather step reads information from the custom settings.ini file, and it reads information also from the hardware itself, what MAC address you have, make, model, things like that. Then, in the pre-install step, there's something called configure. And if you read configure, what configure does is take all those values and on the fly update the unattended XML file before we run setup against the image.
So if I wanted to have the time zone differently depending on in which country I would deploy that image.
Then you need to figure out how can you determine the country. Well, we could determine the country based on a default gateway, right?
Yeah.
So based on default gateway, if this is the default gateway you have, then you should have the following language settings. If that is your default gateway, then you should have the other settings. So that is something you can do in the rules file.
So we often get the question, why can we find information about all these properties that we can use as part of our deployments? So if you open up the the default help file, and search for default gateway.
Yep, the default gateway. And this gives you a pretty good explanation.
So this is how you can assign subnets with different settings. In this, it will install different config manager packages, but I can have the time zone name here so that MDT will assign a different time zone depending on what subnet this machine belongs to. And then it will inject that during deployment into the unattend file, and then setup will use that unattend file.
Yeah. So if we flip back here to my virtual machines, I guess I have a machine running number 2. I think it's number 2. Let's do an F12 on that machine. Nope, it's not that machine. Let's do another machine. Here it is. The reference image. Revert. Start and connect. So this is going to boot up on an ISO, and it's going to connect to the deployment share. And I'm going to pick a sequence. And when I pick the sequence, it's going to read all the values, and then just before it starts doing the configure, we can run that from the command prompt, so you can see what happens.
So after you created these deployment shares, when you update them, you get boot images. These boot images you add to the Windows deployment server so that you can F12 and start the deployment, or you mount the ISO like Michael did, and then you can start the deployment that way. But at this part, you can see it's actually reading the settings file that we demonstrated on the server. And when you select the sequence, it will later inject those values in.
So I put in a pause, and the beauty of that is because then you can press F8, and then you're in the command prompt.
Sir? It's simply not green enough.
Oh, the color is wrong.
And the people in the sheep seats, they can't see if we don't do this.
Thank you so much.
Well, you get the idea.
Yeah, I think I get the idea. // MDT01, MDT build lab, $sign, scripts, and CTI configure. And what you can see here, it's already collected all the information using CTI gather, but what we see here, which is the next step, it's reading all this information, and it says I can't find the information for whatever, but it can find the information for time zone name. So it's going to update the unattended XML file, which is in MDT works as a template, right? So it copied down the template to the Windows installation, and then it modifies it on the fly. In this case, it's on the Windows PE. You see it's changing the language, it's changing the destination of the disk, and it's changing a couple of other things too. So that's how it works.
So the configure action will copy the template from the control folder of the server of the sequence to the C drive, will modify it, and then setup will continue and modify the now changed unattend file.
Yeah. There are actually 2 configure steps in the sequence. You have one here before we inject the drivers, and there's actually another step running down here in the post install. But that is the major part that runs in the beginning, which changes everything in the unattended XML file to be installed correctly based on the rule set we have.
Now, the cool thing with this sequence and these rules, these settings that we apply, we can actually test them without doing a deployment at all. We can verify that the stuff that we put in the solution actually works at deployment time. And that's same for light touch like this is, or config manager as well. So
yeah, basically, if I want to just play with them, I can do that on the server. You just need to be very careful what you do. So I'm going to open a command prompt here, and I'm going to change the colors and the font.
No,
that was the.
How about selecting text first?
Yeah, I'm going to try that. Then we can select the fonts, modify modify it like that. So let's say that I want to try my unattended XML file. Well, cscript, // mdt build lab scripts, and then we have something called CTI gather. Now, I also need to specify what unattended XML file I would like to try. The custom settings.ini file I would like to try. And then you just add ini file, colon, / mdt01, mdt build lab, $, control, custom settings.ini. And maybe you want to add a value. Maybe you want to see what happens if you add the value of OSD computer name, colon, Mike 001.
So when
Now,
you edit...
before
Wait.
Yeah.
When you edit stuff in the inner file, you have the property equal and the value. When you want to add them for testing at command line, it has to be / and it had to be a colon instead of the equal sign.
Yes. So now we can just try this and see what happens.
This is like a PowerShell what if. What if I run this command?
And we can see we have information about it's reading the it's reading the custom settings.ini file based on time zone. We have the logs, things like that. You got a bunch of errors in the middle. It's because we didn't load the Microsoft BDD utility.dll, so it cannot see the virtualization properties from the machine. You can load it manually if you want to do that. So this is a way of trying and playing and testing with the custom settings.ini. And then you can use the CTI configure.WSF to see what would the unattended XML file end up in the case I'm running this custom settings.ini file, and I configure it. This is the result I will have in the unattended XML file. So this is a way of playing around with it. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
So what we also can do, if I flip back here, is of course to run a replace task sequence. Microsoft Deployment Toolkit covers 3 basic scenarios. We have the new computer, we have the refresh, which means upgrade, but for professionals. And then we have the replace, where we replace the computer. A replace task sequence basically gathers the information and it captures the user state of that machine and puts that on a file server or on a device if you want to do that too. And then you run the new installation, a new computer on another machine, and then it's going to ask you, where did you have the data? Do you want to restore user data? And yeah, I want to restore user data. Where's the location? Oh, it's whack, whatever it is, or it's from this USB drive or whatever it is. And then it's going to put back the user state to that machine. So if we try to run this from an existing machine, I think this is this is very legacy. It's called XP.
You might have seen it.
You might have seen it from time to time.
But the idea is here, we want to replace this XP with something else.
Yeah, with whatever.
Windows Vista.
No, you're not allowed to install Vista either. I mean, if you do XP, don't change into Vista. That's...
No, Windows 7 or Windows 8. Pick one.
Yep. MDT production. It's a $. I can't remember the name here.
What Michael is trying to do is to run a script from the deployment server. It goes well for you?
It should, because that's the right path. MDT01, MDT production.
Can you actually ping the server from that machine?
Yeah, I think I can. I'm just going to verify that that's the correct path. I did it before, so I should be able to do it now. Yep.
Check.
Clipboard. Type. Yep. Scripts.
And it turns out you have to type in the correct path to the script
I know.
you want to run.
Oh, God, I hate myself. Script.
You can also use a group policy preference to push out a shortcut to run the script. Could be useful.
Thank you so much for that. It's really
Just saying.
helpful. You run the light touch VB script, and if you remember correctly, I typed in command line parameters when I did the CTI gather, when I did the CTI configure. It's possible to do that here too. So in this case, it's going to ask me, and I'm going to do a Windows 8 installation on this machine.
Weren't you supposed to do a replace?
It's replacing. It's going to ask, where do you want to save the data?
Well, if you do that, it will be a refresh.
Yeah, sorry. It was a refresh. Because I was running that. If I want to do a replace, I can do that. But in the refresh, it's going to save the data. It's going to use the hard link migration feature in USMT. If I want to do a backup, I can select to do a backup of the machine. Anybody has a good criteria of doing backup of machines? When should you and when should you not?
Always?
Depends. If the person you're migrating has a higher pay grade than you have, you should absolutely do a backup. Otherwise, it depends. You specify language, you specify settings. Some of these settings I have defined to be questions, right? So when we do come out to customers and we show them a complete silent installation of everything, go like, yeah, but that means we need to know everything from the beginning when we start. And that is not always the case. So having a wizard is fine, and Light Touch do provide a wizard. So you need to define how much questions should it ask. In this case, for instance, it's asking for the location of the machine here. That is a configuration in the custom settings.ini file. So it gives you a list of selectable OUs you can put the machine in. And it's possible to configure this in many various ways. So it's going to be workstations. I'm going to next, 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 next. And the password is, of course, password. It's always password.
And after about 20-some minutes, we have a Windows 8 machine being deployed here, or upgraded to Windows 8.
Yes.
Refreshed to Windows 8, I should
Refreshed to Windows 8. Now it's doing the capture user state, and if you want to take a peek, you can go into My Computer, open the drive, and you need to be fast, and you can see the state store, and you can see that UseMT has started. So this is basically Light Touch. Now, if you do have Configuration Manager in place, and we usually define that as a working Configuration Manager installation, then you should absolutely consider to integrate MDT with Configuration Manager.
So this is config. How many of you are actually using Config Manager? A good few hands. Now, you might recognize this sequence. This is a standard integrated MDT sequence in Config Manager 2012 SB1. And if you think it looks like the sequence that Michael showed you, it's because it's the Config Manager team that actually writes the sequence engine that is being used with Light Touch, and always has. It's just a standalone version of the same engine. Now, since December last year, it's even more getting together because the config manager team took actually over the development of MDT as a solution. So I hope to see even more integration as time goes by with these products being developed. And they used to be separate teams. And I really see it as an advantage to have them in the same team. So the OSD team for Config Manager also does standalone OSD deployment solutions right now. But if you go back to what we have been showing you, I've been showing you components, we've been showing you tools. They still exist in Config Manager. So in Config Manager, we have boot images. So if I need a new boot image, well, I will simply create one. And I follow through a wizard and I get a boot image. In Light Touch, you would update the deployment share and you get a boot image. Fine. You add in operating system images. This is simply where you add the Vim file that you want to be able to deploy through Config Manager. Michael did that in Workbench by right-clicking and importing. Here you right-click and you say add. I mean, that's similar. Drivers, adding in the same way. We just don't use folders that much in 2012 because it sort of doesn't make any sense at all to use. Because if I create a folder, like a Dell folder, I can't import drivers to it. I can't do that from folders. So I need to be on this top node to be able to import drivers. So instead of putting them in folders like I would in 07, I actually simply just tag them with the correct category because that helps me find them when I search for drivers in my repository. And then I simply create driver packages out of those drivers that I import. So I have a few different driver packages here. Now, the in file. Let me show you the difference between Light Touch and Config Manager. And you need to pay attention because this is tricky. Because in Light Touch, you need to go to this folder and you need to modify this file. This is Light Touch deployments. Now, Config Manager is completely different because you need to go to another folder and change that file. Same file that are being used. We just used some different properties. Most variables are the same between Light Touch and Config Manager, but not all of them are. But it's listed in the documentation which values that are for Light Touch, which values that are for Config Manager, and which values that are for both. But the story is exactly the same. We have an ini file that controls and have some information about the deployment. For example, in this case, all right, what OU to put the machine into? That means I can have 10 sequences that all 10 are using this settings package. When I deploy those 10 sequences, they will get the OU being added to them. Because in that same sequence, guess what? There will be a gather action. There will be eventually, hey, where did you go, my friend?
Configure?
Yes, I'm just blind. It's only on the eyes.
You missed it.
You did. There we go. That step will do the same thing that Michael did. It will take the settings, copy the ANA10 file, which is also in the same package. It will copy this template, it will inject the values, and then the setup step will actually use it later on. So, same story. And we can do the same simulation. We can run that command script, command file to make sure that the settings actually works.
And if we start looking at third-party deployment tools, they work pretty much the same way they also. It's all about modifying the unattended XML file just before we do the installation, either manually by having thousands of them or on the fly doing update of it.
Yeah. But there are some things you should know about Config Manager 012 and the MDT integrated sequences. And for example, when you apply the image down here, by default, this one is being set to false, which will make your reference image end up on the D drive, E drive, or F drive in Config Manager 12, which you normally do not want. You want to have the image on the C drive. So you should really change this value into true so that you will honor what you have in your reference image, which is captured from the C drive, so it actually will be deployed to the C drive as well. Then, Michael mentioned the three core scenarios: bare metal, refresh, and replace. Config Manager supports that as well. But for some reason, the last scenario, the replace, is actually broken. It doesn't work in the default template. Because, and how they could miss to test this, I don't know, but I know the fix, however. When you do a replace in Config Manager, you call the state migration point, or that role, that function, to restore the backup. They forgot to add the action that actually calls that state migration point. So you need to add that in. It's simply as going here, go to add, go to user state, and say request state store, fine. And then you say it's going to be a restore, and you set a condition, use empty locals not equals true, so it's only being used for the replace scenario and not for normal refreshes. And then it will restore the backup, and then you release the state store again, so you add that step as well. Could there be another setting that is sort of by default not that bright in this sequence?
Depends. If you work for a security organization or a security that cares about any form of security, I think blank password is a bad thing to have for the local admin. Or do you think that's a good thing to have?
No, but it is really easy to log on.
It is.
Now,
instead of logging on as the user, you just log on as the local admin and you're logged on.
This, in MDT 2012 Update 1, in the new sequence template where Microsoft merged their normal deployment sequence with the UDI sequence into one, this is the default configuration. It will enable the admin account and set the password to blank. I mean, the fix is not that difficult. If you don't use UDI, disable the account and just set a random password. If you want to use UDI, set a password, and life is good. Simple as that. Now, Light Touch, by default, it's using a wizard when you start the deployment. It prompted you for a sequence, it prompted you for location, whatever for your capture, but you can automate that fully in Light Touch. Config Manager by default is automated fully, but we can have a wizard if we want to. Built in is the UDI Wizard Designer. It supports all the three scenarios, and it allows you to, if you want to, you can actually prompt for information even when you do Config Manager deployments. So for example, it could be that you are using the new user-centric deployments that you have in Config Manager 12. So I'm targeting Office and Adobe and possibly Java, no, not Java, Adobe and Office to Michael as a user. And in Config Manager 7, it would be that he would actually get a machine deployed, he would log on, he would wait an hour, 2, 3, and then all those applications would be installed that were targeted to Mike as a user. Because in Config Manager 7, we really didn't do much user-centric deployments because the way it was, well, built. Now, in O12, what we can do is I can still target applications to Mike, but when I deploy Mike's machine, I can ask for who is going to be the primary user of this machine. Well, it's Mike. And then, as soon as the sequence is finished, it will actually start to deploy the applications that are targeted to Mike. And then it will, of course, complete the deployment.
Now, the important thing here is something that we have those discussions with customers. Should we do Light Touch when I need to have a wizard? Or should I do Zero Touch when I don't need a wizard? And the discussion about zero touch and light touch has nothing to do with if it's light or if it's zero. I can do, as Johan told you, the same installation or the same experience, completely silent using light touch or completely wizard-driven using Configuration Manager. So they pick and choose between doing light touch. Why is the naming light touch and zero touch? Anybody has a clue why they named it light touch and zero touch? Could it be marketing?
It could be.
Could be. Because it's possible to do it either way. So you pick and choose these two solutions based on other things than the wizard or the silent install.
So,
question over there.
So the question or the comment is, in light touch we have a bootstrap INI file, that's an ini file that actually lives on the boot image that will, for example, determine what deployment share to connect to. You don't have that in Config Manager. No, you don't, because Config Manager will pull the policy from the management point. Can you try to rephrase that? Okay, so the question is, in light touch, there is an ini file on the boot image that you can modify to either prompt for a user or actually log in automatically. In Config Manager, you have the same option, but it's different, because when you create a boot image in Config Manager, you can set if you want to have a password or not on that boot image. So that will give the same feature that you have in Bootstrap Ini to provide a password. But indifferent to light touch, it's not pulling an Active Directory user. It's actually a hard-coded entry that is put inside the boot image, unless you do a PXE-based deployment, because then it's being injected. But yeah, so you can achieve the same thing, but the technology behind it, it's different. Now, if I open up a sequence again here, and let me go back. I already had it open. The way we assign applications in Config Manager, I mean, in light touch we simply add into the workbench and life is good. But in Config Manager, you can add in either packages that you have in Config Manager or applications. So you can add in lists of applications, and each list can have 10 apps in this list, and of course you can have multiple lists. There is a bug that is being tracked if you have different values in the different lists, but that can be worked around. Or I can simply say to the sequence, hey, skip using static information. I was working with a customer in Finland not long ago. They had some 35 sequences. 35 sequences of the same operating system, because they simply added different applications in this list. And they had simply 35 lists of apps for different departments and, part of the organization. Now, what you can do instead is you can simply use the default behavior, and that is storing that list outside. So you simply use a variable instead of hard code the apps. And then you can go back to your ini file, and you can specify the applications in here through dynamic, through sites, through models, through hardware, through whatever value you can come up with. You can combine it and give different...
Would that be possible to do if you do light touch?
Yes.
Say that based on this make and based on this model, I should have the following applications, and that could be a list too.
Yeah.
It could be dynamic, it could be a static list. I mean, it doesn't matter, you can do the same thing.
So the real question is, there are only two solutions from Microsoft to do deployment. They have a bunch of tools, ADK, Windows Deployment Services. They are not supposed to be used directly. They're supposed to be used indirectly by the solutions. And our philosophy is, if you do not have Config Manager, go ahead and use Light Touch. It's a superior deployment solution. It can be used from companies from 1 site to 6,000 sites, 300,000 users. And Config Manager can do that too. And it can go out to network with 500 people. But if you have Config Manager, we recommend that you use OSD in Config Manager and that you add MDT, the zero-touch features, to it, because it adds some 280 plus features. And I know that because I had to list them a short while ago for a project.
But what we don't recommend is you trying to manually configure, create the unattended XML file. And the excuse that we hear so very often is that it's too hard to learn MDT. It's too hard to learn how Configuration Manager works. It's just, I don't have the time. Well, I can assure you this, you don't have the time to figure out how an unattended XML file should work either. You can spend hours, days, weeks, even months before you get it right. There are so many nice features like you can't use extend partition at the same time as you specify the size in one location. In the other location, you must specify size, otherwise you can't specify extend. What? And you really need to read all that. We don't even use that. We use either Microsoft Deployment Toolkit and do Light Touch, or we use Configuration Manager together with Microsoft Deployment Toolkit.
All right. So
it's a question over there.
Why should I integrate MDT with Configuration Manager if Configuration Manager OSD has everything else I need?
So the question is, why should I integrate MDT with Config Manager? Last year, we did an entire session just answering that single question. But it's basically 3 things for me, at least. It adds dynamic deployments to be able to store settings outside. It adds a development framework that I can use to quickly automate stuff or customize stuff in Config Manager. And it adds those 280-some features that are not by default added or available in Config Manager. And to me, those are so valuable, so I never use it without it. And please come forward after this session. We don't have anything we need to run away to, and I can show you a little bit on why we reason to always do that implementation or addition, always, always. I met so many customers who had been deadly afraid and just, no, I would never, ever integrate, never. And once I have been able to demonstrate what you actually can do with the integration, I have never failed to convince them to do the integration. But we'll be around here for, well, as long as it takes. There is some gathering this afternoon in the exhibition area.
Yep.
But there are resources out there. The Deployment Artist.com website has a list of all the resources for stuff we do, trainings, videos, books, articles, our blogs, you name it. Deployment-related info are on that site or links to it.
We're going to stay here for the rest of the week. We have a session every day, at least.
Or two.
Or two. So we're going to hang out here until Friday. Feel free to come up and ask questions to us.
All right. So thank you guys for taking your time.
Thank you.